Welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast, where we cut through the hype. This podcast brings you emerging aviation technology insight without the fluff, so you know where the industry is today to shape the future of tomorrow. Welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast. This episode is sponsored by the UAS Cluster Initiative. So today I sit down with Julia Norsetter, Transportation Policy Lead at Reed Smith, a global law firm. Julia is a qualified attorney and has extensive experience in aviation and new transportation technologies, such as unmanned aircraft systems and advanced air mobility. Julia has an in-depth understanding of the evolving regulatory landscape for new aviation technology, both domestically and international markets. Prior to her role with Reed Smith, Julia spent several years at the Federal Aviation Administration, most recently as a senior advisor in the policy office. So the focus of our conversation today was around advanced air mobility and what some of the challenges and opportunities are in the immediate future, and what the industry and FAA are doing to move the adoption of this technology forward. So one disclaimer, we do spend some time discussing the need for pilot and operational requirements for advanced air mobility from the FAA, and within minutes of finishing the production of this podcast, the FAA had posted its unpublished integration of powered lift, pilot certification, and operations notice to proposed rulemaking. So I guess that means this conversation was pretty timely. This also means you'll have to tune in for part 2 of this conversation to discuss the new developments. Hope you enjoy the episode. All right, welcome to the Rethink Vertical podcast. Special guest today, Julia Norsetter, former colleague, friend, and she's the Transportation and Policy Lead for at Reed Smith, and super excited to have her on the show today. Julia, welcome.
Hi, thanks so much, Craig, for having me. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. You know, we'd seen each other at FAA, and now to be reconnecting in this exciting space is really cool.
Yeah, it is definitely, and I think it'll be interesting for the listeners to get to hear. I know you focus broadly on transportation issues at Reed Smith, but I know that one of your focuses is advanced air mobility and all the stuff going on in the eVTOL world. So I'd like to spend some time, if we could today, just kind of talking about some things that are interesting to folks, to me specifically, and get your feedback. And does that work?
That works for me. Yeah, let's kick it off and see where this conversation goes.
Yeah, very good. One of the things that comes up a lot, and for me personally, I'm thinking about timelines. A lot of folks, when you talk about technology, especially hardware, in an environment that's highly regulated. What are the timelines we're looking at for actual advanced air mobility operations? I mean, we've heard, 2024, 2025, different times for different types of operations. So, based on your experience kind of on the FAA regulatory side, what you're seeing in the industry, what are you looking forward to, and what do you think we will see over the next, 3 to 4 years on the AM side?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One of the great things about FAA right now is that we do have a regulatory pathway for AAM. We have Part 21, which the FAA has indicated that it's going to be using in terms of its type certification. So that is one thing that we do know moving forward for this industry. But, we do need operational rules as well as pilot requirements. So those are a couple of pieces that are going to have to come down in order for us to adhere to that 24 or rather 25 timeline. I know that the FAA has an intent to issue a temporary rulemaking for operations this summer or this fall, with something more permanent to follow that. But I think it's possible. It's definitely ambitious timeline, but I think it's possible. And there are a couple of elements, of course, outside of the control of FAA. Rulemaking processes that are mandated by Congress, industry having its equipment ready for those certification tests and the like. So it's ambitious, but I think it's very possible.
Yeah. So do you get a sense from both, FAA and the industry side that they're kind of doing this in concert? Obviously, we've seen a lot of collaboration and partnership, as they work through this process, especially, future type certification. Do you get the sense that everybody feels good about kind of where things are going, or is there, any kind of areas where folks like, hey, we need to sort of kind of tighten up in this specific area?
Yeah, so I think, it's hard to have one voice for an entire industry, right? So I think that
Yeah.
different folks feel differently about the certification pathways that are being chosen. But, one of the benefits of FAA's approach is that, it's really going to be a performance-based metric.
Hmm.
So what that's malleable, that offers some flexibility for folks to demonstrate their risk threshold and demonstrate, how they want to prove that risk threshold to the FAA. So even if folks aren't, entirely copacetic with Part 21, there is that performance-based analysis that does offer the flexibility.
Right. So the ball's in their court to meet that requirement, and that seems fair. I think most OEMs would they want to see what the goalpost looks like and be able to sort of work towards that. And I think, in my opinion, most folks are probably comfortable with that performance metric, and that's kind of the way things operate, right? In the real world in traditional aviation, I would think.
Exactly, exactly. And
Yeah.
it really does encourage innovation because, if you're demonstrating risk within a box, then that's the way you have to think about it. But if there's some flexibility there, it allows for that freedom of thought to really encourage innovation.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously there's that piece with the technology, certifying the technology, the rulemaking side of it. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, and this is kind of near and dear to my heart, the airspace integration side of it.
Yeah,
There's two pieces, right? There's getting the aircraft certified and safe and
yeah.
approved, and there's how do we actually integrate them into what's currently going on. And just curious to hear your thoughts on kind of where we are with that, and kind of does the timeline line up with what these OEMs and manufacturers want to be able to accomplish?
This is a really good question because AAM, eVTOL operations sometimes get thrown in the mix with UAS or drones,
Right.
unmanned aircraft systems. And I know that you have a really quite a long history in drone work. So
Mhm.
from your perspective in that field, I think that the traffic management is still a really significant issue, and that's due, of course, in part to the large number of drones, unmanned systems operating. They're necessarily without a pilot, and they're operating in large numbers. By contrast, some of those initial integration issues for eVTOL, I don't see immediately rising. In the first instance, with our eVTOL or AAM technologies, they're going to be piloted, and they are very likely to use existing helicopter routes. So it will almost follow the manned aviation or helicopter trajectory, which already has some support. So I see that issue in terms of integration as being a bit further down the road when there's more proliferation of these vehicles.
No, that's a really great point, and I'm glad you mentioned it because I think, like you said, we spend a lot of time on this side talking about UAS operations, and folks will often want to lump in AAM operations into that, and it's at some point in the future there will be quite a bit of integration between the two technologies. But I think, like you said, if you look at the eVTOL industry, we've had some conversations with folks, from NASA and both the FAA who are working on, procedural stuff for eVTOLs, AAM, and like urban environments and all the issues that they've, run into with approach procedure angles and winds and,
Yeah.
stuff that helicopters deal with now. And the reality is, in order to fit a 2024, 2025, even 2026 timeline, they're going to need to use AAM's going to need to sort of kind of just merge into that traditional, airspace picture. But at some point, when those companies start to scale and really do lots more operations and they're landing in lots of different places, maybe as opposed to like one vertiport in one city, they're definitely going to have to start thinking about some of those low altitude autonomous operation, especially when they talk about, moving away from pilot operations. That's a whole different animal, right?
Agreed.
Its own complexities. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, to say that eVTOL are going to be able to follow traditional helicopter routes and be supported by ATC, that's a projection, and it's also definitely not a walk in the park. I mean, airspace management is extremely complex and extremely risky. So this isn't to say that you just can take off today and everything works great. It's just the management, the use case is different from drones in that we're talking about such a small number of aircraft for initial operations.
Right. And I think we started to see that a little bit as some of these manufacturers, start to talk about doing operations in some of these, urban environments like, New York City, and trying to figure out what these routes look like between, Kennedy and Long Island. And so those are interesting because helicopters are already doing some of those similar routes, but it's how do you merge the two together and even, increase the number of operations. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out and how kind of ATC is part of that. It's you can't separate the two. They're going to be involved in some way, whether it's, procedurally or, different routes. There'll have to be a lot of collaboration. I think that's that piece you were talking about. Like we can see what it looks like, but it's not easy to do.
Yeah, I think the concept of deconfliction or deconflicting different aircraft is going to really be underlined in the coming years, which is exactly what you were referring to.
Yeah. So we've talked, a lot about AAM in the U.S. I know that there's a lot going on outside the United States internationally, and I think some of these other areas like Asia and Europe are trying to be first movers in the AAM space. We're seeing a lot of that, a lot of momentum around the next Paris Olympics, and folks talking about being able to do some operations there. Do you see that a lot of these maybe procedural hints or clues about how these operations will be successful? Do you see that happening international first, or maybe in parallel with the U.S.? Like, what's your take on that?
I really will hesitate to say who will be first to certify aircraft. But if we circle back to one of the comments earlier, right, we need the aircraft certification as well as pilot and operational rules. So I think, to have that complete package, I'm not it's to be determined who is going to be kind of first in that. But I will agree with you that there has been some more interest, and I don't really want to name specific countries, but there has been more interest in certain countries in certifying the first passenger carrying eVTOL that they can, right? So instead of saying we're going to hold and wait to think about all the technologies and think about the different aircraft that we have to certify. Rather, there may be some civil aviation authorities who say, let's not think so much about the whole landscape of the industry. Let's focus on these one or two promising models and really get those two craft certified. So using that methodology, I think that there is a possibility that certain technologies may receive aircraft certification quicker through that route.
Yeah, that makes sense. Might be a simpler path right in the beginning, with hopes that they're able to kind of expand upon that concept over time.
Yeah, I agree with that. Because we can always place limits on operational rules to kind of, push back on that safety continuum.
Yeah. You mentioned some of these first AAM cases will be, piloted. There'll be obviously a certain level of autonomy within the aircraft, and I think that's what folks are working through on the training side. I'm interested. I hear a lot about, you see a lot in the news about pilot shortages just in traditional aviation within air carriers. Now we're talking about bringing a whole new type aircraft into the market that will need certified commercial pilots. What does the training pipeline look like for eVTOLs, and what's some of the conversations going on with FAA and different manufacturers about like how they can fulfill this obvious gap in just, trained pilots.
Yeah, so I must admit I have not engaged on the pilot in the pilot conversation with our regulators. So this is going to be
Yeah.
conjecture on my part, but I hope it's
Yeah.
informed conjecture. So
Okay. Right.
so
Yeah.
the first point that I think is worth making is that again, eVTOL AAM are not drones. So this is not
Right.
an out of the box operation, right, where someone can just, someone with some, loose logistics experience can just open the box and operate these aircraft. They really
Yeah.
are airplanes. People
Right.
people have likened them to flying cars, but this really has all of the characteristics of an airplane. So the flyer of this piece of equipment really does have to be a certified pilot, not a drone pilot, but
Right.
a pilot.
Right.
So that being said, the scope of pilot licenses is really quite large, because we have, much small, we have helicopters, we have smaller category aircraft, all the way up to, large passenger carrying aircraft. So there is really a scope, a spectrum rather, of different pilot requirements. So I think in the first instance, I would imagine or could hope that there will be some ability to rely on certification of those smaller, some deviation of a certification of those smaller category aircraft in
Mhm.
order to pilot an eVTOL. So, I think that there is a pathway that can be built upon. And then I also would note that going back to the numbers pieces, right, there's not going to all of a sudden be 2,500 eVTOL operating at once. This is going to be a very slow rollout. And it may be that pilot shortage is unlikely to thwart the industry just because the rollout will be so slow.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I think that when I look at one of these aircraft, whether it's at a conference or a show, when they bring their prototypes in and you can sit in them, I look at it from the perspective of, I imagine for the foreseeable future, as these aircraft start to be certified and come online slowly, you'll have fully rated, commercially rated pilots who have flown everything from, a Cessna 206 all the way to like an Airbus 330, and they're just getting a new type certification, right? That's,
Mm-hmm.
a vertical propulsion, but now they have to learn how to transition the aircraft. And so there'll be some different things that they need to be trained on. So I imagine that that'll be the case for a while, but at some point, there will need to be sort of an established training pipeline for a specific, it is an airplane, but it does do something. It operates, more like a helicopter, but then can transition. So it'll be interesting to see how they fulfill that pipeline, because helicopter pilots, it's very expensive training, and there are not a ton of helicopter pilots. So it'll be interesting to see how they play off that.
Well, this is actually, if you don't mind, I kind of would like to
Yeah,
turn the question back on you for a moment, which is,
sure.
right, with UAS, we've had, I would imagine that we've definitely had a need for more pilots as we start getting into, more proliferated logistics, package delivery,
Mm-hmm.
medical delivery, cargo. Have the pipeline set up by our regulators and by our industry groups, like really trying to get more folks interested in aviation. How have you seen that working out in the UAS industry?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the level of training needed, to become Part 107 certified is, it's pretty doable for most folks. I mean, there's lots of different community colleges and technical colleges offering that training. You can, do it privately if you like. So I think that most of that work's been just getting the word out to folks that this is a viable job.
Mm-hmm.
That you can actually get the certification. It's pretty reasonable to get it price wise, if you are interested in it, there's opportunities to do it. So I think that there's not been a shortage of available pilots because of the ability to train them. I think a lot of times it's just there's not that many folks that know that it's a thing that you can do. I think where it's going to get really interesting is as these aircraft, this is based on Part 107 rules, right? So it's based on folks actually flying the aircraft with some level of autopilot autonomy, but ultimately they're responsible for flying, just like traditional aircraft, right? You take off and you land, and the airplane kind of flies itself between A and B, for most of these air carrier aircraft. What will be interesting to see is how this transitions as aircraft become more and more autonomous, and the FAA allows more and more fully autonomous operations, where now you're mostly like monitoring and observing, but you still got to know the rules, still got to be able to do something, So I suspect that same thing will happen to eVTOLs in the future, right? It'll be fully trained pilots, and over time it'll become more autonomous, and there'll be more monitors rather than pilots. And there's some interesting challenges with that. It's like if folks aren't actually hand flying aircraft, do their skills degrade? So those are some of the things that we're kind of thinking about on the US side too. So.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point because, right, I think for a lot of manufacturers in the AAM and eVTOL space, autonomy is the goal, and that's not an on and off switch to in this industry, right? To say like, oh, one day we're flying with pilots, boop, the next day it's fully autonomous, so. It really is that transition period where there's a lot of challenges where we're working with increasing levels of autonomy in the aircraft and what that means for pilot certifications.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to this idea of kind of maximizing autonomy. What's the path for this? What's a comfortable path for the FAA to approve and certify some of these technologies? And I think about, there's a pretty high level autonomy on traditional aircraft, right? If you're flying overseas in an A380 or a Boeing, even at the new 737s, I mean, they are lots of autonomy, lots of autopilot. They can almost fly from liftoff to touchdown on their own. And I think the reason they've been able to innovate and do that is because they still have a fully capable, certified crew of pilots sitting in the cockpit. And so, but the moment you talk about it, and this is really, from what I see, a lot of these AM companies that are really focused on, getting the pilot out of cockpit as quickly as possible to make the business case use work. It will be interesting to see like what's the step that they need to take to make the FAA comfortable. How much data do they need to provide before they not let these aircraft fly autonomy, because they're going to be able to do that pretty early on, but actually take a pilot out of the aircraft and not have anybody there. So I don't know, what that looks like. I don't know if you have any, kind of understanding of, is there a path currently with FAA, like thinking like, how do we even get there?
Yeah. I think that there's two pieces to this question. And the first one is the risk analysis, right? That's the one that we were just talking about. What is going to need to be demonstrated in terms of redundancies and mitigations in order for the pilot to be able, for it to be able to fly without a pilot, and for that to be approved by our regulator. And I think that precisely that risk numeral or that risk case is what they're working on right now. I mean, they're working on it in the first instance just to certify the craft. And then, there's going to have to be, standards that manufacturers are required to meet in order to have the pilot removed. And it really does depend on the more mitigations, the more backups you have. You've got this backup and the backup to the backup and the backup to the backup. The more of those you have, the better case you have for removing the pilot from the aircraft. But the second and almost more important piece that I would weigh in on is public acceptance, because, it's one thing if it's technically viable to do something, but I don't personally know any people or many people who would be willing to get on a jetliner right now and with no pilot, right? Even though
right.
even though such a great number of the operations are have become automated on that jetliner, the public acceptance piece is a really big one, and that's going to be a big nut to crack to achieve that full autonomy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I was thinking about a friend of mine who is a captain for a large airline and a former F-18 pilot, and he talks about like the from the time he started flying high performance aircraft to now, and how most of 85% of the time he's a passenger in this aircraft, but that from the public acceptance point, like they still see somebody get on the airplane, go up there, close the door and lock the door. Now, whether he's sitting there and just monitoring systems is beside the point.
Right.
If something happens, he's able to take over. And so I wonder, like, from the training perspective, you talk about the training pipeline for eVTOLs. I think, from what I hear, a lot of these manufacturers are going, okay, we get it. Like, that's a difficult challenge from a regulatory and a public perception side. But can we think about ways to certify these pilots in a different way that doesn't require $40,000 of training, that they can, there's a level of autonomy that we can trust them enough to have a reduced level of competency in the cockpit. So it'd be interesting to see how that all plays into the public acceptance side.
Yeah. Too. And where that matrix or where those lines intersect in order to have the business case make sense for the AAM manufacturers, right? Like how much can they invest in pilot training, versus autonomy in order for the business case to make sense? That'll be a really interesting evolution and probably a challenging piece to for them to develop. But it's been an impressive industry so far.
Right. No, for sure. So last thing before we wrap up here. We've talked about some of the challenges. Are there any other challenges that you sort of see that we haven't covered that folks should be thinking about as far as these companies being able to grow and scale that are developing eVTOLs?
Yeah, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about regulatory. We've talked about autonomy. So just throwing in a couple of other, and with every challenge is an opportunity as well. So just throwing in that little nugget. But I think, it is worth mentioning, of course, the infrastructure that's going to be needed for these to proliferate. Helicopter pads, have very specific standards for their use. They have weight standards and other thresholds. So it isn't necessarily so easy to say that if eVTOL is going to be able to land wherever a helicopter can. That's just not necessarily going to be the case. So infrastructure currently receives only about 2% of the funding or investment, rather, that the principal aircraft receives. So there's a lot more room for development on the infrastructure side. So I think that's something good to focus on. And also, we do have a lot of manufacturers coming to the table here with different aircraft prototypes and the like. And I think one of the challenges in the future is that there is going to necessarily have to be some culling of manufacturers as we get from prototype to for full marketability. So one of the benefits of having so many people in the market right now is that it's really helping push that technology advancement. But once we get to this certifiable stage, necessarily there will be some market culling, but opportunities for partnerships and for, joint ventures among companies. So, also rife with opportunities there.
Right. No, that's a good point. I'm glad you touched on the infrastructure piece. That's something, on the UAS side, we think about that a lot too. It's funding infrastructure. Is it publicly funded? Is it privately? Is it public-private partnerships? Yes, and it's all of the above, in my opinion. But yeah. Well, Julia, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and it's always great to chat with you. But specifically for other folks to hear the conversation, which I think is why it's valuable to do these these podcasts. I don't want to be the only one getting all this good information. So, thanks for joining us, and look forward to our next opportunity to talk.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your time today, Craig. I really appreciate it. And, with all of these exciting developments, I think it won't be too long before we're back on the line together with another episode.
Right. If you'd like to be a part of the UAS Cluster Initiative community and get access to more of our content, check us out at www.uascluster.com.